Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our studies now as an introduction to junior American literature. Now, right away, we're going to have an obvious problem. As we begin our study, this is, of course, an introductory set of comments. We'll obviously amplify as we go. But the most obvious question, if I tell you guys, hey, let's study American literature, is, well, what is American? And, you know, I mean, it's a tough question. It's going to be through our whole study a question that we keep coming back to. Is it a country? Is it an experiment? A number of years ago, the Irish frontman for the band U2 called America, what did he say that upset a lot of people? He called it an idea. Some have called it a story. Anna Quindlen has called it the quilt of a country. The conundrum is what she'll call it in her famous essay that she wrote after the tragedy of 9/11. I'm going to argue in our attempted answer to this, and it will be an amalgamation of all of those and many more. I like to think of America, though, as a collection of stories, plural, not story. And that is to say, from Anne Bradstreet to Amanda Gordon, from Jefferson to Arthur Miller, there's all these stories that we're going to be playing around with. And of course, the key for us is to be reminded that fundamentally we are the stories that we tell and the stories we retell, no question. We're also the stories we decide to accept or to reject. And that will be important for us, and that's why we will say in 303 that the new is the new, the N-E-W is the K-N-E-W. And as you're now beginning to take a few notes, and I'm hopeful that you are, we're going to work through this idea of what is exactly the project, how are we going to approach our study together. And by the time we get to the heart of our study, in our study of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, we'll find ourselves really trying to answer the question, well, what is this thing we call America that we're all a part of? Now, let's review some basic logistics really quickly. If you go to learnstrong.net, and I hope that you have, and I hope that right now you're even looking at it, and down that left-hand side, if you'll see our junior tab there, and the My Perspectives tab more particularly, you'll see first of all that we're going to be drawing from primarily two text sources, textbook sources, anthology sources. One of those will be our Pearson, the other of those will be our My Perspectives. And of course, we're also going to be working off of our Canvas, and week by week you'll see the assignments as they're presented there. Now, just to remind, our standards, reading, writing, speaking, listening. On the reading side, just to remind, we're going to be working with our 3 levels of reading, and all of this will come back to our understanding and our definition of learning, as we've already articulated in our introductory set of lectures there at learnstrong.net on our homepage, those 4 introductory lectures. My assumption is that you've already looked at those, but let's just review quickly. We'll be working with every text that we're looking at. We'll be looking at 3 different levels of the text, answering 3 guiding questions. What does the text say? Level 1, summary. What does the text mean? Here we subdivide it 2A, 2B. Here we're looking at 2A, themes and messages of the text. And in 2B, that's our rhetorical level, literary techniques, not what Whitman says, but how Whitman says it, for example. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, how can I relate to other texts that I'm familiar with? And again, our use of the word text is very inclusive, guys. It includes everything you've read, listened to, watched, obviously, video gaming and playing, and the like. And then finally at 3B, and because again, our definition of learning is to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, we're hopeful that we can somehow connect to each one of these. And my goal for all of us in our study is, again, to come back to the question about every one of these texts. Well, what does that mean to me as an American, or maybe not an American engaged in this study? Now, of course, our goal here is weekly evidence of reading and writing, and we'll have mechanisms to demonstrate that. You're doing it right now as you're taking a few notes, right? Now, we will take, and there's a lot of different ways, guys, to study American literature. We will take a chronological thematic approach, and by that we mean we're going to start with the early beginnings of America, whenever that is, and there's a huge debate about when do you actually define the beginnings of America? And there's a number of answers that we'll provide. And yet, within each one of these chronological units, we'll be also messing around with different kinds of themes literature of different types of America, if you will. Now, in Unit 1 in Semester A, we'll go through this quickly. In Unit 1, we're going to be messing around with the literature of early America from whenever those beginnings are, and again, we'll engage in that, up through around 1800. We're going to look at native peoples and their cosmogonic stories. We're going to look at Bradford and Bradstreet and Edwards. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God will be one of our classic studies. And then we're going to look at Arthur Miller's Crucible. Now, this is interesting because this is a play that was written actually and performed in America in a pivotal moment of McCarthyism and their Red Scares. We'll talk about it. But the play is set during the time of the Salem witch trials, during this time in history, and so we'll come back and we'll study it that way. We'll actually begin and end our year together of junior study with Arthur Miller. At the front end, we'll be with Crucible, and at the back end, Death of Salesmen. And then finally in this Unit 1, we'll look at Franklin, Jefferson, and both of the Madisons, and we'll pay attention to what some have often called those early founding thinkers, and we'll have something to say about each of them. When we meet, especially Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, I've often said in 303 Guys that there's this rumor that you guys as juniors in high school are not very patriotic to your country, to which I've often said, I'm not sure, A, I'm not sure that's true, but B, if it is true, I've argued that the reason it's probably true is people like me haven't given you a good reason to be a patriot, because you're not born a patriot like the color of your eyes. I think that you have to choose to be a patriot. And we got to give you some good reasons to consider why you live in an amazing country. With all of its foibles, with all of its flaws, it is true that Thomas Jefferson, the crafter of the Declaration of Independence, that precious document in our nation's history, owned slaves himself. We're not going to run from these observations. We're going to, in fact, address them directly. But I want to give you enough reasons to maybe sit up and say, wow, what Jefferson and his pals were pulling off, it's a pretty courageous act. And when we get there, we'll hopefully have that observation. The second unit for us will move to a literature of a growing nation, and of course already a warring nation, 1800 to 1870. Here we'll meet our Hawthorne, our Poe, our Melville, Emerson and Thoreau, the great transcendentalist thinkers, and then finally, as we said a few seconds ago, Dickinson and Whitman. And in some ways you could make the argument, and I have made this argument in a series called Talks with Walt at learnstrong.net, that Walt Whitman kind of invented the idea that becomes America. Now, of course, other thinkers like de Tocqueville had commented on the whole notion of the melting pot. Well, more to say about de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. But it's really Whitman in his Leaves of Grass in 1855 and on that will fundamentally begin to create what many have called the myth of America, what I like to simply call the story or stories of America. At Unit 3, at the conclusion of Semester A, we will work with the literature of division, reconciliation, and expansion. And this is 1850 to 1914. And we're obviously talking about wars, the Civil War, and then obviously with 1914, the beginning of the First World War. Here we're going to see our Douglas, our Lincoln. We're going to study Crane. We're going to talk with Twain and Chopin, as well as the great Willa Cather. Now, I'm giving you just highlight names. If you go to LearnStrong and you look at our playlist, you'll see a lot of others, and then of course ones that aren't even on that playlist. In the second semester, we'll begin with Unit 4, the literature of disillusion, defiance, discontent, 1914 to 1945, pivotal time, obviously, in the history of the world and obviously in the history of America. Here we're going to come to T.S. Eliot and our study of Eliot and Ezra Pound, his pal. Fitzgerald's Gadsby will be studied, Hemingway and Faulkner will be studied, Frost, the great American poet, Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance will for us matter, and then as well the Steinbeck. Now, for us, as we work through that, we will admit that America has a history of constantly fighting, and we'll get to in a moment maybe why that is the case. In Unit 5, we'll be with the literature of prosperity and protest from 1945 to 1970. We'll work with poets like Jarrell, Plath, Sexton, Bishop, Brooks, Baldwin, Morrison, and we'll spend some time with the political figures of the Kennedys, the two important ones for us, as well as, of course, Dr. King and Malcolm X. And then we'll finish our study of American thought in Unit 6 with the literature of new voices, and again, new frontiers from 1970 to the present day. And again, as we said, the new is the new. So we're going to see this interesting cycling that starts to happen. We'll be working with Alvarez as well as Alice Walker. We'll come back to finish with Arthur Miller's Death of Salesman, as I mentioned, Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, Amanda Gorman's classic, The Hill We Climb, that amazing poem that she presented at an inauguration for President Biden. And that will be how we will finish. And the hope will be for us that your voices will become a part of the American voices and stories that we're talking about. Now, one of the central ways that we approach text through a prism, if you understand my use of that phrase, is through what we call our Big Five. So let's just review these really quickly. I know we've had some exposure to this already, but let's just review. Every time we look at a text, okay, we will want to pay attention to at least 5 different perspectives. Now, this isn't all of the perspectives, but it's 5 that we find in Room 303 compelling and necessary. The first of those 5 is what we call epistemology. Epistis of, or related to knowledge, what you can know. In other words, how do you know the things you know? And again, there's kind of 3 perspectives on our view of knowledge and what we can know. One is absolutism. I am right, you are wrong. If you are not agreeing with me, then you are fundamentally wrong. I am absolutely certain of what I know. Of course, the problem with that is lots of terrible things, and we'll see this in American thought and in American history. Lots of terrible things happen from that absolutist position. Well, there is the complete opposite of the absolutist position, which is the relativist position. There is no right, there is no true, there is no fact. And of course, the problem with that is what we call the performative contradiction. Well, to say there is no truth seems to posit a truth. And so epistemologically, we're often going to struggle. Well, okay, obviously the relativist position doesn't work, but I don't want to be an absolutist. And in Room 303, we're going to find ourselves looking at a lot of the texts that we study with the suggestion for the fallibilist position epistemologically. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. That I could be wrong is fundamental to the way we think about any notion of knowledge. Why? Because it's humility. It's basic science. This is what I think. I'm going to hold to this position epistemologically, in terms of my knowledge, until I find data to prove otherwise. Again, this is why we say we're the stories we decide to accept or to reject. But before we're going to reject a story, we probably should know that story, right? And try and understand it, have some respect for it. The second of our Big Five is ontology. It's the flip side of epistemology, of course, ontology, over-related to who you are. Well, obviously you're a body, but you're also a mind. And we're also going to read a whole lot of titles that say you may be something even more than mind. We call it spirit, consciousness, whatever you want to call it. The third of our Big Five, psychology, the study of the individual mind, the study of motivations, anxieties, fears, what motivates an individual to behave. And then the flip side of that coin, at number 4 of our Big Five, is sociology, the study of groups. When we pick up, for example, a text like Arthur Miller's Crucible, how can you explain the fact that so many people behave in this bizarre, hysterical fashion? We're going to be talking sociology. And then finally, number 5, and for many students, this is the real tough question, the question of theodicy, Theodicy. The question of why must there be pain and suffering in this world? And what is it that I can gain from that kind of pain and suffering? As Whitman will try to teach us, as Thoreau will try to teach us, as Emily Dickinson will try to teach us, maybe we're going to learn to no longer ask, why is this happening to me, but rather for me. We'll get into it. Now, as we are finishing here our observations and final comments, as you begin this study with us in junior American literature, obviously, we've got some very tough questions to try to address. This question of what is an American is rooted in lots of stories. For example, the Greeks had a famous story about a cat named Prometheus, you've, I'm sure, heard of it, who will, against the will of King God Zeus, decide to give fire to humans. Zeus says, don't do it. Prometheus says, up yours, I will do it. He defies God. Dude, he actually shouts the F word at God. And he gives fire to humans. Which is amazing for us as humans because, of course, we can do all kinds of amazing positive things. We can cook our food. And really terrible things as well, right? We can invent terrible bombs and stuff from this use of fire. For this, Prometheus is chained to a rock, and every day in the Greek story, this huge bird of prey comes and eats out his liver or his heart, depending on the translation. And what does Prometheus do? Well, does he beg for forgiveness from God? No! He screams at God, I did it! I do it 1,000 times again. Therefore, to be Promethean is to mean what? Well, don't tell me what to do. I have often argued that when you want to define Americans, fundamentally, we are fundamentally, on one hand, extremely Promethean. That is to say, don't tell me what to do. And we're going to see this again and again in our study of American thought. But there's another story that comes from the biblical corpus, not the Greek corpus, from the biblical corpus, the school out of Jerusalem, as we'll sometimes refer to it, as opposed to the school out of Athens. And it's a story about a chap that goes on a walk alone, and he is accosted by some bad guys who do terrible things to him. And several people walk by and see him there on the side of the road in terrible pain, about to die, and don't do anything. They have no real good reason to stop and help. And then there is a kind of, a person who's kind of an enemy to this person that's been wounded, a Samaritan. And that's why the story is often called the Good Samaritan. And he goes over and he helps this guy. Now, this is a very intriguing story in American psyche as well. Why? Because we also have, not just the don't tell me what to do part of our psyche as Americans, but we also have that can I help you side of our psyche. And it's powerful. It's a powerful part of our cultural psyche as well. When we want to see how the tension works between these two. In the end, I'm hopeful that our study together will allow for all of us to have both a personal response to the literature and a collective or communal response to the literature. That is to say, we're going to talk about these titles as they relate to you individually and as well to all of us. Now, to begin that study, I want you to turn to a set of introductory comments where I will give you an introduction to Western thought. I'm going to have a little drawing on the whiteboard, and I want you to flow that. And from there, we'll then jump in to our first unit. I look forward to our study together. I think it'll be a lot of fun. Thank you.